Let's talk about data and our sources or references for a little bit. Do you know the difference between a primary and secondary reference? This is a little bit different than the primary and secondary data that we talked about earlier. Now we're just talking about references that we look up. So a primary source is one that is the original source for the data that you're looking for, or the results. Government agencies are often primary sources. For example, data on inflation, financial output, unemployment numbers. These usually come from a government agency that is collecting that data, and then they report on it or publish it. A secondary source is a reference that repeats the data or results found in a primary source. So for example, an article in the New York Times discussing last month's unemployment rate. You can find the unemployment rate there in the New York Times article, but that rate number likely came from the Department of Labor. That was the primary source. Just some notes about reference sources. There's some obvious reference sources. I'm going to show you one, the Statistical Abstract of the United States, and there are many government databases that can be used. But even with these, you always want to validate those sources of data. So look in the footnotes. This will also tell you something about the assumptions or the conditions for using the data. And sometimes the summarized data is wrong. So these databases or gathering places, sometimes they gather the information wrong. Always use a secondary source to find your primary source if possible. Go directly to that primary source. You may need to look in multiple sources. If you find different answers, this implies something about the data and the method. So some uncertainty, but also maybe it tells you about how the data was transformed or manipulated to be used in the reference source. Always cite your primary source in your analysis, even if the secondary source is how you found your numbers. So the sad news, I told you that Statistical Abstract is an obvious place to find some numbers and some data, but the sad news about this is that there have been funding cuts and the Stat Abstract is not going to be useful for much longer. The last one was published in 2012, with most of the data collected around 2010 or before. So for most statistics, the Statistical Abstract is a secondary source, but those numbers were collected directly from the primary source, which usually federal government agencies or private marketing firms. Now, the Statistical Abstract is useful as a reference that we can go to look for primary sources in the footnotes. So it still has a compilation of all of these interesting facts and statistics. We can still go look at that and then look for the primary source in the footnotes to find more recent data. I want to give you an example of how or why it is important to look at the references and know where the data that you collect are coming from. So if you were to do an internet search right now for the population of United States, the first 4 hits would be very different numbers. These are the ones that I get when I do that search. So which of these is correct? Which one is the best answer? Well, I'll give you a hint. The top hit is not the most correct or even the most recent. It's also a secondary source. Let's look at these 4 different estimates or 4 different values that we got from the internet in closer detail. The first hit was 328.2 million people. And we got that just from Google. This is a secondary source. So where did they get this number from? They said that they cite the U.S. Census. Also, as we're reading more into these data, this number that they have, we realize that it's not current, up to date, I should say. They update occasionally, and this one's about 3 months old. The next hit is 331,002,651, and that comes from the worldometer.info. Is this a primary or secondary source? This one's secondary. If you look into this, you see that they get this number from the United Nations, their population information. And if you go to the UN population information, you find that they get their information from the US Census. So I'm gathering that the US Census is our primary source, right? Another bit of information about this value is that they say that it's from 2010 with an algorithm that brings it to current time. So 2010 plus a model. The next number, 329,799,379, comes from census.gov. Here we go. This is our branch of government that goes out and collects population data. So this should be our primary source. When we look into this, though, we see that this is their official live estimate. They've calculated this up-to-date value using birth rates, death rates, immigration rates, and emigration rates. So sometimes even our official numbers are an estimate. They're not really counting every individual, but they're using census data, older census data, and population growth rate, and some model to estimate the population between their collection periods, between their actual census surveys. The last number here, 328,953,020, comes from Wikipedia, our source of all truthiness. It is a secondary source, and we look and see where they get their information from, and they say they get it from the U.S. population clock, which is our census website. Well, why isn't that number the exact same as the one that we collected from the population clock? Because Wikipedia updates occasionally, and this one's about 6 months old. So which of these 4 numbers would you use? Would you round? Should you cite an actual number with 9 digits, like this one? Would you project into the future? This is the current live estimate. What would make your results relevant, and does it really matter? Well, it really depends on the goals and the needs of your study. So for example, if you needed to know the U.S. population value to build a spreadsheet model, you might use a different number than if you're writing an article that won't be published for 6 months. But in general, always use as many digits as you have available in your calculations, and then round to significant figures for your final answer. We will have a quick refresher on significant figures soon, and look at more ways of modeling and calculating our estimates.